So I'm going to talk to you today about advanced watercolor techniques that you can use to do some of your independent study work, or just on your own, or just for this particular assignment. What you're going to need are watercolor paints that come in tubes, as opposed to the little kid ones that you buy, which are set across a palette type in circles. These ones that are sold in tubes are just a little bit better quality. And the other option you can do is a watercolor pencil, but we'll discuss that a little bit later. I'd like to begin with just some basic watercolor techniques using watercolor paint from tubes. So I've already laid out some of the paint on a palette, which is what you're going to do. You're going to need a variety of bristle brushes, and the brushes should be a little bit softer than you would use for acrylic painting when you're doing watercolor painting, and a variety of sizes as well, because the different ways you can handle the paint with different types of brushes. Now, I think you'll probably notice I've used green tape here, and I've taped down my watercolor paper. This is special paper. It's sold by weight. It's heavier than a normal paper, but it isn't as on a board per se as a canvas for acrylic painting. So it is different. It's usually sold in a pad, or you can buy individual pieces of watercolor paper at Michael's Art Supply store and other art stores around. The reason you want a nice quality heavyweight paper is it will buckle less, and it's acid-free paper, so it will be better preserved. And you'll find if you use your normal cartridge weight paper that's sold in sketch pads, that paper is really not going to grab the paint the same way, so you won't get the same results. So use a good quality paper. You're going to start by, yours will be flat on a surface. Mine is tilted up just so I can show you. You're going to need some water, a lot of water. And one of the techniques to begin with a watercolor painting is simply to get the paper saturated wet with water before you begin. This technique would be called wet on wet, because we're going to be applying several colors of watercolor onto a wet paper. And when it's wet, the advantage to your watercolor painting is that the colors are going to bleed into each other. They're going to blend for you with very little work on your part. Now, that is one technique. And I'm going to start with some color now. If you're going to sketch something out in pencil, you should do that before you apply the water. But in my case, I'm just doing a technique today that you might try advanced things later on that you could add to it once the background's dry. But you can see it's just very loose. It's not a great deal of planning. It's very experimental paint at this stage, because the paint just goes where it chooses. You're just guiding it a little bit, and you're taking different colors and you're just letting them blend into each other. An important thing to remember when you're doing a watercolor painting is that if you need an area to be pure white, you're going to have to purchase a masking fluid. And the masking fluid you would put down before any paint and let it dry completely before starting. I don't use it per se for most of what I do, because I don't usually have a solid white mass in my painting, or if there is a little spot, if I'm very careful about it, if my white spot was, say, the entire bottom, I might just leave this at this stage instead of having to go out with that extra expense of buying a masking fluid. But if you're doing just a nice experimental background, you may want to just keep going and put all the shades in that you want. This is a different shade of green. Sometimes you'll see the white of the page because watercolor builds up in layers. So when you start it wet like this, it's going to run down, and because of the gravity, it's forcing my paint down, leaving me with like a streaky effect. And that might be how I start something like a landscape assignment, for example, where I want to show, a nice horizontal background and maybe a sunset with different shades in the sky. So that is one technique. Now, if you have some table salt at home and you were working on a landscape scene, or maybe water, or just want some texture, maybe it's something abstract you want to do and you just want to experiment with that technique of watercolor to see what it can do, you can use table salt in a different way than you might imagine. You just take some of that salt and you simply have the wet areas still wet on your canvas, and you're just going to throw that salt onto the wet paint. You leave that until it's dry, and what that will do is create a surface texture, and that surface texture will create itself. You don't have to go in here and rub it in deep or anything at all. It will do the work on its own once it's dried. So what I would do if I were typically building a painting is I would do it layer by layer. This is my first layer. Is I add more colors, and those colors in particular dry. Then I'm applying dry onto dry, but it's going to have to sit for a little while to get that paper back to a dry stage. And what it would do is, every time I add a layer, the color in behind is going to change. So it works unlike an acrylic painting, because you can actually sort of correct something in an acrylic painting, whereas this, it's going to be there. It's not going to come off again once you have a color there. So you just go with it and you work it up layer by layer. And the more colors that you put in a background or a foreground, it doesn't matter, the darker the layer is going to come out. So I might go in now, what if I wanted, a darker color here? Go in, add some more color, and when that color dries, then I might go in, add another layer. And that layer could be my shadows, or it could be some detail work. So that's exactly how you work with watercolor. And I'm going to do some advanced techniques in watercolor pencil for your advantage shortly. And the other thing that you can do with watercolor is you can wet a canvas by using a spray bottle. So if you have an old spray bottle at home, just fill it with some water and wet down your canvas this way, your watercolor paper. As you can see, that salt is now reacting with the water on the watercolor paper, and it's starting to create some textural effects. So I'll zoom in. The green paint there has the salt texture. It's going to be a little bit more pronounced as it dries. And you can see when you use several shades of green. I mean, if I were going to paint grass, for example, outdoors, I would want that. You don't see in the natural world a sky being solid blue or grass just being solid green. There's always going to be tints and shades of the same shade. Even you can use the opposite complement to create shadows. The complementary color on the color wheel of any color, you can mix that in your color to create shadows as well.